All right, let's dive into this research on teenagers. You sent some over, and it looks pretty fascinating. I'm definitely curious to dig into it with you. We're going to be talking about all sorts of things like brain development and body image and
Yeah.
how those things kind of work together.
Absolutely. And I think the really important thing to remember here is that we tend to talk about teenagers' brains like they're, off on their own. But if we want to really understand what's going on, we need to factor in the social and emotional stuff too. It's like we're missing pieces of the puzzle if we don't.
Okay, yeah, so let's start putting those pieces together. Um, I was reading about adolescent egocentrism. It's like they think they're the star of the show 24/7, right?
Exactly. It's this super intense focus on themselves and what everyone else thinks of them. Think about it. Like, imagine being an eighth grader. First pimple pops up. You're dying for braces. And you think everyone's looking at you, judging you. That's a egocentrism in action. I bet you remember that feeling, right?
Oh, totally. It's like you've got this imaginary audience just waiting to, I don't know, critique your every move. And speaking of being judged, that kind of brings us to body image. This research says it plays a huge role in how teenagers view themselves.
It really does. And the stats on this are really eye-opening. During adolescence, especially, like between 13 and 15, girls go through a really dramatic increase in how dissatisfied they are with their bodies. I mean, we're talking more than double the dissatisfaction with their weight, their hips, their thighs, compared to just a couple years earlier.
Wow, that's a huge jump.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what's behind that kind of sudden shift.
Well, think about it. Puberty hits. Hormones are all over the place. And, everywhere they look, there are these images of perfect bodies. It's a recipe for insecurity, especially when you add in that feeling of being watched by an imaginary audience all the time.
And then there's social media, too. That
Right?
just seems to amplify those insecurities, doesn't it?
Mhm.
The research even says that, like, 86% of teenagers believe that social media is bad for their body image.
Yeah, that's right. And it makes sense. The more time they spend scrolling through these carefully curated feeds, the more these unrealistic beauty standards kind of get stuck in their heads. It's this constant comparison game, and it's really hard not to feel like you're coming up short.
Yeah. So it's like this perfect storm. You've got the biological changes and then the social pressure. And then you throw this digital world on top of it all, which is constantly feeding them these unrealistic expectations. No wonder body image is such a big deal during those years.
Exactly. But we've got to remember that, even though body image is a huge preoccupation, teenage thinking is actually developing in some pretty incredible ways too. They're starting to be able to handle like much more complex thought processes.
Yeah, like that idea of Piaget's formal operational thought, right? That's where they start thinking abstractly and using logic in these totally new ways.
Exactly. It's a major cognitive jump. That classic experiment with the balance scale. Younger kids really struggle to get the whole weight and distance thing. But adolescents,
Hmm.
they can use deductive reasoning to solve it. It's like their minds are becoming these powerful engines, and they're not just figuring out what is, they're starting to explore what could be.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like they're finally getting the tools they need to think critically and see the world in a more nuanced way. But here's what I find really interesting. They don't always use those tools, do they? I mean, they still make some pretty impulsive decisions. The
Mhm.
research mentions this concept of dual processing, where teenagers are operating on both intuition and logic at the same time.
Absolutely. Think of it as like having two operating systems in your brain. One is super fast, it's intuitive, it's driven by emotions, and
Hmm.
that's a system they've been using for years. But then the other system, that one's slower, it's more logical, more analytical, but it's also like still under construction. They're still figuring out how to balance these two systems.
So it's like they've got this brand new, super fancy car,
Yeah.
but they're still learning how to use the clutch and all the gadgets and stuff. No wonder they sometimes, stall out or take a wrong turn.
That's a great analogy, and it explains why they sometimes make decisions that seem totally irrational, even though they're actually capable of logical thought. It's that impulsive emotional system kind of taking over the wheel.
Like that example in the research with the teenager who bit the police officer. She obviously knows that biting people is wrong, but in that moment, her emotions just like took over.
Exactly. That intuitive system driven by, I don't know, protective instincts or maybe a sense of injustice, it just kicked in. It really shows how strong emotions can just override, even a really well-developed understanding of the rules. And this two-sided way of thinking, it plays out in a lot of different ways, especially when we consider the impact of technology.
Right. I mean, teenagers are basically attached to their phones these days. And as we talked about earlier, that's not always a good thing. The research talks about cyberbullying and sexting as examples of how those impulsive, emotionally driven actions can have serious consequences in the digital world.
And the statistics on that stuff are pretty scary. Cyberbullying, especially, is super common between 11 and 14, those peak egocentrism years where those impulsive emotional tendencies are at their strongest. Combine that with, being constantly connected and the fact that things can spread so quickly online and the potential for harm is just like huge.
It's like they're walking through this minefield. You've got all this social pressure and emotional triggers, and then every click, every comment, it can create these ripple effects that they maybe don't fully understand.
That's why it's so crucial to understand how teenagers think. It's not about excusing their behavior, it's about seeing where it's coming from.
Hmm.
Recognizing the developmental stuff that's happening. When we look at their choices through that lens, we can start to make sense of their world. And even more importantly, we can help them make sense of it too. It's like, we're giving them a map and a compass to figure out this crazy landscape they're dealing with. And speaking of crazy landscapes, middle school, that's kind of be a tough time for a lot of kids.
Oh, for sure. Puberty's going full blast. The social scene is changing like crazy, and then the schoolwork gets so much harder. It's like everything's happening all at once.
It really is. The research even calls it a perfect storm of, developmental challenges. It says that moving to middle school often leads to grades dropping and more problems with behavior.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. It's like they're trying to juggle, I don't know, flaming torches while riding a unicycle on a tightrope or something. No wonder some of them end up dropping a few torches. But I'm curious about how their mindset plays into all of this. The research mentions this idea of fixed versus growth mindsets.
Yeah, it's also called entity versus incremental theories of intelligence. The basic idea is that some kids think you're either born smart or you're not, like it's fixed. But others believe that you can get smarter by working hard and learning. And the research shows that the kids who have that growth mindset, they tend to do better in school. They're more likely to stick with things even when they're tough and to see, setbacks as chances to learn.
So it's not just about like being smart. It's about believing that you can actually get smarter. That seems like a really powerful message, especially for kids who might be struggling.
It really is. And it shows just how important it is to encourage that growth mindset in kids, praising them for their effort and how they bounce back from things, not just focusing on their grades. That can make a big difference.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So how does all this stuff play out in high school? Do those same patterns and pressures kind of keep going?
Yeah, to some extent. But the research points out that high school is a little different. Usually the most intense physical and emotional changes from puberty have settled down by then, and their cognitive abilities are more mature, so they're better equipped to handle the schoolwork.
And hopefully by then they've had some positive experiences that have helped them develop a more, resilient and adaptable mindset.
Right. But there's a lot of debate about the best way to get high schoolers ready for what comes next, especially with all the pressure to go to college. I mean, the idea of college for all is great and all, but it doesn't really acknowledge that college isn't the best fit for everyone.
Yeah, it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Exactly. For some students, vocational training or apprenticeships might be a better path. And it's super important that we provide those options and see them as just as valuable. You don't always need a college degree to have a fulfilling and successful life.
It's about finding the right path for each person, not making everyone fit into the same mold. But how do we even know if these different educational approaches are working? The research talks about this PISA test. It seems like it's about more than just memorizing stuff.
Yeah, the PISA looks at how well students can actually use their knowledge in real-life situations. It's about critical thinking and problem solving, which are really important skills no matter what you do in life. And it's interesting to note that the U.S. hasn't done so well on this test compared to other developed countries.
That's definitely something to think about. Makes you wonder if our education system is doing a good job balancing, you know, getting kids ready for standardized tests versus actually fostering a love of learning for its own sake.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, standardized tests can give us some useful data and make sure everyone's meeting certain standards, but they don't always show the whole picture of learning, and they definitely don't show the full range of skills and knowledge that students need to really thrive.
It's like trying to, I don't know, measure how smart a fish is by how well it can climb a tree. It just doesn't make sense.
Exactly. We got to find better ways to figure out what students are good at and then help them grow those skills, not just focus on how well they can memorize facts and pass a test.
Right, right. And speaking of helping students grow, Those quotes from the student climate activists at the beginning of the research really stuck with me. They were like challenging the system and demanding action on climate change. They had such a deep understanding of these complex issues.
Those quotes really show what teenagers are capable of. They can do incredible things when they're passionate and engaged. They can think critically, connect with things happening all over the world, and even fight for change.
It's like they're finally getting to use all those new cognitive skills to actually make a difference in the world. But we also know that adolescence can be, a pretty rocky time. How do we help them navigate all that while still encouraging their intellectual curiosity and, their idealism?
That's where understanding how teenagers develop is so key. It's about seeing their choices not as simply good or bad, but as part of where they are in their journey, both cognitively and emotionally.
So instead of just like dismissing them as hormonal teenagers, we can try to understand their behavior a little better.
Exactly. And that understanding can be really powerful both for the teenagers themselves and for the adults in their lives. It opens up possibilities for, better conversations, more effective guidance, and ultimately a smoother transition into adulthood.
Makes you think, right? Like what would have helped you back then when you were a teenager? Was it maybe a better environment at school, or like being able to talk openly about body image and all the pressure that comes with social media? What do you think?
Those are really good questions. And honestly, I think looking back on our own experiences can teach us a lot about what might be helpful for teenagers today. Sharing those stories or even, sharing this whole deep dive with someone who's raising a teen, it could start some really interesting conversations.
Yeah, for sure. Because at the end of the day, these aren't just like teenage problems, are they? I mean, we all deal with insecurities. We all make impulsive decisions sometimes, and we all, struggle to find our place in the world. It's just that adolescence is like this super intense time for all of that stuff.
It really is. It's a time of huge growth, incredible curiosity, and, this amazing idealism. And I think if we can understand the challenges and the opportunities that are unique to this stage, we can do a better job of giving young people the tools they need, the tools to deal with those challenges, embrace those opportunities, and ultimately become confident, resilient, and thoughtful adults.
So to all the teenagers out there, hang in there. Keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and remember that your experiences, your thoughts, and your feelings, they all matter. And to the adults listening, even though it might not always seem like it, they're listening to you. So keep talking to them, offer support, and trust that, with a little understanding and guidance, they'll find their way.